Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviours within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behaviour or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In the first episode of this podcast, we introduced this metaphor of the secret sexual basement as a way of explaining the deceptive, compartmentalized sexual relational reality that is constructed by the person engaging in some kind of problematic sexual behavior within the context of an intimate relationship. And remember that the central idea there was seeing it as a two-part problem rather than just a sexual behavior problem. Those two parts being, number one, the behaviors that happen inside the basement, and number two, the behaviors that keep the basement hidden. In this episode today, we're now going to dive a bit deeper into one of those two behavioral systems. In this case, the behavior that happens inside the basement. So the sexual or relational behavior that violates the fidelity agreement or expectation of the relationship. As we zoom in on this piece, we once again have two important factors to consider. And so I'm going to start by introducing a new term, CES, which stands for Compulsive-Entitled Sexuality. So that's the term we are going to use within this model when we talk about the sexual or relational behaviors that occurred inside the basement. So if we start by zooming in on that phrase, compulsive-entitled sexuality, we have two key words there, compulsive and entitled. If we start with the compulsive point, this is going to be very familiar to many people approaching this kind of work or living this kind of story, because most of us are aware to varying degrees of compulsivity and how it might relate to sexual behaviors. We might also consider compulsivity as being closely linked to addiction, and the sex addiction term in particular is often used heavily within this kind of work. And so for many people where there's been a discovery of a secret sexual reality within the relationship, sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior treatment will likely be the first port of call. That might be through personal or group therapy, or it might be through joining something like a 12-step sex addiction group. And compulsivity is a very important part of the puzzle for many people, and therefore it's also an important part of our CES criteria. However, we're also seeking to broaden the scope a little by adding this second entitlement piece. If we just stick briefly though with this idea of compulsivity and addiction, it is worth noting that from a diagnostic point of view, sex addiction is not actually currently an officially recognized diagnosis, whereas CSBD or compulsive sexual behavior disorder is. Now that's an important topic, but to avoid going off on too much of a tangent in this episode, I think it's easier to just consider compulsivity and addiction as overlapping terms and look at how we can consider if a pattern of sexual behaviors fulfills an appropriate criteria for compulsivity. Our first and perhaps most important criteria would be a lack of control over the sexual behaviors. So for something to be classed as compulsive or as an impulse control disorder, there needs to be that sense of a persistent failure to control the behaviors. As an extension of that, we would often expect to see numerous unsuccessful attempts for the person to reduce or stop the repetitive sexual behavior. Because if somebody has never attempted to control the behavior or reduce the behavior, it's actually quite hard to know if it's actually out of their control or not. Next, we would also often see these repetitive sexual activities becoming a central focus of the person's life, to the point of neglecting other interests and responsibilities, or despite adverse consequences or impairment in other areas of the person's functioning. We might also see that the person actually derives little or no satisfaction from the behaviors, but can't seem to stop doing them. And so a simple summary we can use for compulsive sexuality, given the factors I've just mentioned, would be sexual behaviours where the person lacks control or is unable to stop or resist engaging despite negative consequences. As a brief aside, the one thing that criteria lacks, which is the key difference between recognizing a compulsive behavior versus an addiction, is the idea of escalation. So for something to be diagnosable as an addiction, we have to be able to demonstrate an increase in intensity, frequency, or risk to achieve the desired effect. Now, anecdotally, many clients will recognize escalation within their own behavioral patterns, which is one of the reasons that the terms sex addiction or porn addiction are popular. But again, for our purposes here, we'll just stick with the term compulsivity. The key thing we really want to take from this then is that when we think of the compulsive part of CES, or compulsive-entitled sexuality, we're talking about an out-of-control behavior that the person on some level doesn't want to engage in. When we consider it strictly through that lens, perhaps it will strike you that that's actually quite a narrow definition that many people who present for this kind of treatment won't necessarily fulfill. We do therefore have a problem in this field, certainly from my perspective, where if somebody has engaged in infidelity of some form, has had an affair, has engaged in any kind of secretive or problematic sexual behavior, they often very quickly have that label of sex or porn addiction put onto them, without any real consideration of whether it actually fits or whether there are perhaps other significant drivers behind the behavior that might be really important. There will be many people who don't really fit that criteria, where the behavior isn't necessarily out of control or where there haven't been attempts to stop or reduce the behavior in any way. And so that's where in this model, we also want to highlight the second part, which is the E in CES that stands for entitled. If we start by defining entitlement, generally speaking, as the belief that one is deserving of or entitled to certain rights or privileges, then we can acknowledge that entitlement can actually be healthy or unhealthy. So there are many healthy entitlements. I might feel that people should be entitled to an education or entitled to be kept safe, for example. But entitlement can also be unhealthy, particularly when it harms or violates the rights of other human beings. A simple definition for unhealthy entitlement would be the psychology of the prioritization of personal experience and gratification over the human rights of others. And when we talk specifically about sexual entitlement, as we do in this model and in this idea of compulsive-entitled sexuality, we can slightly alter the definition even more to the psychology of the prioritization of personal sexual experience and gratification over the human rights of or the harmful impacts on others. In its simplest form, therefore, we can think of compulsivity in this model as I don't want to do this behavior, but I can't stop myself from doing it. And we can think of entitlement as I want to do this behavior, so I do it. Compulsivity is an I can't stop problem. Entitlement is a I don't want to stop problem. Now, there are various types of entitlement that we can consider that might contribute directly to a secret sexual basement. One would be socialized entitlement, which is often related to power, privilege, or social status or context. This can very much be a conscious entitlement or a subconscious assumed entitlement that we might not even really be aware of. And a specific version of socialized entitlement would be male sexual entitlement. So the idea that men are entitled to have their sexual needs fulfilled by women, particularly in the context of a marriage. It could show up in the form of a belief that it's my partner's duty to fulfill my sexual needs, for example, however I define or express them. Another important form of entitlement would be entitlement from victimization. Whether I've been legitimately victimized or whether it's purely my own perception, victimization or the feeling of victimization can breed resentment, anger, and it can breed entitlement. If I take the example of a marriage again, I might feel that I am entitled to have my sexual needs and desires fulfilled by my partner. And if my partner is not willing to fulfill those needs and desires, I might start feeling a sense of victimization or frustration or resentment. And that feeling might become a justification for my sexual acting out. It might make me feel entitled to build or maintain the basement. Whichever type of entitlement we're talking about here, it comes back to that idea of the prioritization of personal sexual experience and gratification over the human rights of or the harmful impacts on others. So hopefully you will see again that there will be many people, as I said previously, that present for this kind of treatment, who've built and maintained a secret sexual basement, but who don't fit the criteria of compulsivity or addiction. So we want to really highlight this other part of it, the entitlement that can be such a significant factor underlying the beliefs and justifications that enable the ongoing behaviours to occur. In terms of how we apply it in this model, I want to be clear that compulsive-entitled sexuality is a hybrid concept, so it doesn't have to be one or the other. It's often an interrelated pattern of both of them, because even if the behaviour is primarily compulsive, and the person resonates very much with that criteria of compulsivity, we can still explore the entitlement that might occur that allowed the person to justify the hiding of those behaviours, or perhaps the normalization of those kinds of behaviours amongst men. We can think of what we call locker room talk and the expectation that this is just what men do, it's not a big deal. So how much does that feed into the basement or set the foundation for the building of the basement that perhaps then does eventually develop into a compulsive behavioural pattern? On the other hand, there's going to be people that resonate very much with the idea of entitlement as opposed to compulsivity. I particularly see this with men who have maintained a long-term secret sexual basement, but then upon discovery are actually able to stop the sexual behaviours very quickly without slips, relapses, really without significant struggles in many cases. And if we again consider the criteria of addiction and compulsivity that we looked at and the out of control nature of those things, then it should at least make us sit up and take notice if the behaviours are able to be stopped and able to be controlled very, very quickly upon discovery. I'm not saying that can't be the case with compulsivity as well, but it's something that we can at least be curious about. I also find that looking at it through this lens of entitlement is sometimes actually very liberating for certain clients. For many people I've worked with, as I've said previously, their first port of call might be to enter a 12-step program. That means they're essentially starting an addiction model treatment plan because perhaps they've been told somewhere along the way that that's what they need to do. But they often find that on some level it doesn't really resonate with them. Perhaps they're sat in groups with people who are really, really struggling with the compulsive sexual element. And again, they just don't recognize that in their own story. So whilst it can sometimes be uncomfortable to sit with this idea of entitlement at the beginning of the work, as I said, it can actually be very liberating to have a fuller understanding of the conditions that enabled the secret sexual basement to be developed in the first place. We could go into a lot more depth on each of these ideas, but that should give you an introduction to this hybrid concept of CES as a way of framing the behavior that happens inside the basement. I've given you two simple definitions: compulsivity being sexual behavior where the person lacks control or is unable to stop or resist engaging despite negative consequences, and entitlement being the prioritization of personal sexual experience and gratification over the human rights of or the harmful impacts on others. We can then meld them together to give us our simple definition for CES, which is an inability and or an unwillingness to control sexual urges or behaviors, even when they cause significant negative consequences for the self or others. In the next episode, I'm going to start breaking down the second behavioural system that we've talked about. So we've now looked today at the behaviours that happen inside the basement with this CES idea. And next, we're going to start looking at the behaviours that keep the basement hidden. So the second part of the two-part problem. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.